Mary and Enrico met at school. We had been in the same class since we were 8, and Enrico immediately took a liking to me, a quiet girl with a long, thick braid who had moved from another city. For a long time, he watched me from afar, not daring to approach me, but one day he plucked up the courage and offered to walk me home from school. I shyly agreed. It turned out that I lived a long way from the school. We had to take a bus, and Enrico paid for both of us, spending every penny he had on it. "Why doesn't your mother pick you up from school?" "It's dangerous to travel so far on your own," he asked himself. He himself lived just a 3-minute walk from the school. "Mom works a lot," I shrugged. "We don't have a father, so she has to earn money on her own. I also have 2 younger sisters who go to kindergarten, and in the evening, I pick them up and take them home." Enrico was surprised again. He was an only child, and all his parents' love was focused on him. "Do you want me to take you home every day?" he asked. I nodded shyly. "I'd really appreciate it," I admitted quietly. From then on, we became best friends. Enrico and I supported each other in every situation, and when we grew up, we started dating. We entered the same university, but in different departments. I decided to study foreign languages while Enrico chose chemistry. After receiving our degrees, we decided to get married. Mary's mother, Elena, loved Enrico very much and thanked God every day for sending her daughter such a beloved son-in-law. "I won't be afraid to die when I know you're in good hands," Elena often said to me. I dismissed her, even though my heart squeezed with an inexplicable premonition. "Mom, what are you talking about? It's too soon for you to die." And I would hug her affectionately. Elena had aged prematurely and looked older than her years because she had worked so hard all her life. Now that her daughters were grown up, her life became a little easier, but she still didn't know how to take time for herself. Of course, Elena worked less, but she never went anywhere, even though she had been offered vacations many times. I even wanted to buy her a trip, but Elena refused. "I can't sit still," she said. "In the sea, you don't have to stand still," Enrico joked. "You just have to lie on the sand and enjoy the sun." "I can't do that," Elena laughed, shaking her head. In the end, Enrico and I left her alone, but we shouldn't have done that. If I had known what would happen, I would have been more insistent. After the university graduation party, we started preparing for the wedding. I was buying a wedding dress, shoes, and other accessories, while Enrico was looking for a restaurant where we could celebrate the wedding with family and friends. Everything seemed magical, and I enjoyed every moment of the preparations. One day, while I was signing invitations with my mother, she suddenly went very pale. "Mom, what's wrong?" I asked, alarmed. "I'm dizzy," my mother admitted. "I've been feeling unwell all day." "Why didn't you say anything? You should have called a doctor," I said reproachfully. "Mom, you don't take care of yourself." "But I had to help you choose the wedding cake," replied my mother, her voice very weak. Her eyes were watering and her face was paler than usual. "I could have done it myself," I replied, touching Elena's forehead and exclaiming in fear. "Mom, you have a fever." Elena just nodded. She tried to get up from the table, but she didn't have the strength. Noticing this, I became very worried. "Mom, you look terrible. I'm going to call an ambulance right now." I ran to the phone and called the doctors. Then I called Enrico and asked him to come. He said he'd be free in an hour. I helped my mother up and took her into the bedroom. As soon as Elena laid her head on the pillow, her eyes closed and she fell into a deep sleep. Poor mother, I thought. Finally, the ambulance arrived. The doctors entered my mother's room and stayed there for about 15 minutes. Then an elderly doctor came out and told me, "Your mother needs to be hospitalized urgently. She needs a thorough examination." From what she told me, she hasn't seen a doctor for a long time. "We suspect it's not just a simple cold." I covered my mouth with my hand, frightened. "Then I'll go straight to the hospital," decided Enrico. "That's not necessary. I can handle it," I replied softly. "I don't want to leave you alone right now," Enrico insisted. "Which hospital are you going to? I got the address from the doctor." "I'll be there in 15 minutes, said Enrico and hung up. I mentally thanked him for his care. Seeing my beloved in the hospital lobby, I threw my arms around his neck. "Thank you for coming," I whispered. "Everything will be fine," Enrico replied. Elena was examined thoroughly, and the results were disappointing. She was diagnosed with a serious illness at an advanced stage. To our questions about the possibility of a cure, the doctors just shook their heads in the negative. "Unfortunately, you sought help too late," said the doctor in charge of Elena. "Medicines and therapies are unlikely to change anything. Only a miracle can help Elena now." Hearing the doctor's verdict, I cried bitterly, burying my face in Enrico's shoulder. He held me tightly and stroked my hair in silence. Words could no longer help. "All you can do is look after your mother and give her all your love. She has at most 2 or 3 years to live." I cried even more. I felt so sorry for my mother, who had dedicated her whole life to her children and was now condemned to die. A clear idea formed in my mind. Now it was my turn to sacrifice something for my mother. When I told Enrico this, he just shook his head. "Mary, it's not your fault. That was your mother's choice. You don't have to sacrifice anything," he said reasonably. But I didn't agree with him. "Mom has done so much for us and our sisters. I can't be ungrateful. I'll do everything I can to make your last years as comfortable as possible." "What about your sisters? Should they sacrifice their lives too?" I shook my head. "No, the girls are majoring in programming abroad now. Their lives are just beginning. They need to study. What about you?" "Me? I've been offered an assistant position at the university. I can work there part-time. The rest of the time, I'll be at my mother's side." Enrico swallowed. "What about us? What about our wedding?" he asked softly. I cried. "We'll have to cancel. I can't devote time to my own family at the moment." Enrico couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Do you want to break up with me, Mary?" he asked, astonished. I looked at him sadly. "I don't want to. You're the best thing in my life, but I can't do anything different. My mother is very important to me. What about you? Would you wait for me for 3 years?" Enrico stared into my eyes. "I love you very much, Mary. I've loved you all my life. But now you've decided to sacrifice everything and push me away. I don't know what to say." With those words, Enrico stood up and, staggering slightly, walked down the hospital corridor towards the exit. I watched him go for a long time, certain that I would never see him again. 3 months passed. Enrico neither called nor wrote, and I had given up hope of ever seeing him again. I looked after my mother diligently and spent all my time off work by her side. The woman was slowly wasting away, plagued by headaches and insomnia. When she did sleep, it was restless. Elena turned completely gray, becoming an old woman. I was the only one who could cheer her up, and Elena thanked God every night that she had such a loving daughter. My sisters also called almost every day, but they couldn't come. Their scholarships were barely enough for themselves. They were very worried about our mother and upset that they couldn't be there, but I reassured them that I was managing fine. "But sometimes you want to take a break and go somewhere," they said. "I'm fine with everything," I replied, although deep down I missed Enrico. Where is he now? What is he doing? Does he still think about me, or has he erased me from his mind forever, closing his heart? I didn't know the answers to these questions. I lived in the present, without looking back or to the future. I tried not to remember the happy times I shared with Enrico, but he often appeared in my dreams at night. I would wake up with tears in my eyes and couldn't forget the feeling of my beloved's familiar warmth for a long time. 3 months after he left, I found an email from Enrico in my inbox. At first, I couldn't believe it. He hadn't been in touch for 3 months. Deep down, I thought he had decided to break up for good, and now this letter. With trembling hands, I clicked on it and started reading. "Darling, how are you? I hope you're well. How is Mrs. Elena? I'd be very happy to hear that she's better. I'm sorry for disappearing for 3 long months. It was very difficult for me to understand and accept your decision to sacrifice our relationship. I've always thought that loved ones should be together in the most difficult times. I believe it's easier to get through sad and difficult times, which life unfortunately often throws at us. But you decided differently, and I respect your opinion. I couldn't stay in our city. Everything reminded me of our love and of you. I couldn't walk down the street without remembering how we used to walk together. Even at home, everything spoke of you, your presence, our photos together. so I made a decision. I took only what I needed, bought a bus ticket, withdrew all my savings, and went to the first city I didn't know anything about. After spending a few days there, I moved on. In each city, I wandered the streets alone, went into cafes, and watched the people. It was very painful to see young couples like us, who were together, holding hands, talking, and I imagined you. What if we had taken this trip together? But that was impossible, and I understood perfectly well that you couldn't leave your mother. So I tried not to look at the happy couples and concentrated on my thoughts. I thought about how all my previous life plans had been destroyed in an instant. Now I had nothing left, and I had to create something new to continue on my way. Of course, now I didn't have any references or a map, but that gave me an advantage. I could start from scratch, however I wanted. However, for a long time, I couldn't understand who I was. The wound inside me was too deep for me to breathe freely and dream of anything. Sometimes it felt like I would never find peace and would wander the world for the rest of my life. As soon as I reached the next town, I wanted to leave immediately. On the road, I felt a little better. I could just dissolve into the music playing in my headphones and not think about what my life had become. But in one of the towns, I wanted to stay for a while. The city impressed me with its quiet tranquility. It was an old city, and I spent a lot of time wandering the cobbled streets, walking along shady boulevards or by a beautiful lake, inhaling the scent of flowers. One day, while sitting by the lake, near a pier where a group of boys were playing, it was a warm day and I lazily considered taking a dip, but I was in no hurry to decide. The boys dived headfirst into the lake and resurfaced with splashes. One of the younger boys stood to one side. They called out to him to join in the fun, but he just waved his hand. "You know I can't swim." "You'll learn," the older boys shouted with laughter, but the boy wouldn't go near the edge of the pier. However, the others had no intention of leaving him alone. Two boys ran up to him, laughing and shouting, and dragged him into the water. The boy resisted as best he could, but the boys were older, taller, and stronger. Finally, there was a splash as the boy was pushed into the water. Seeing that, I jumped. Now I could see that the boy was desperately thrashing about in the water, trying to grab hold of the stake that held up the pier's planks. The other boys, thinking he was pretending, laughed at him. Suddenly, I realized that the boy was drowning and that there was very little time left. I ran down the pier and, without undressing, jumped into the water. After swimming a few meters, I reached the boy and grabbed him and brought him to the surface. Once above water, I shouted for the boys to help pull him onto the pier. Several hands reached out to his limp body. Then the boys helped me too. I laid the boy on the planks and gave him artificial respiration. The boy started coughing and began to breathe. I stood up and gave the boys a disapproving look. "Why did you do that? Didn't you hear what he said?" They lowered their eyes, guilty. "Does anyone know where this boy lives?" One of the boys raised his head and took a step forward. "He's my cousin. He and his grandfather came to visit us from the capital." I looked at the boy angrily. "And you let your friends treat him like that?" The boy blushed and didn't know what to say. "Do you live far away?" I asked sternly. The boy waved his hand in the direction of the nearest street. "Our house is about 10 minutes away." I nodded. "Help me get him up. He can't walk home on his own now." The boys obeyed and I picked the boy up. He was very thin and fragile, so carrying him wasn't difficult. His cousin guided us and we soon arrived at the house, a beautiful and rather large mansion with a soft blue hue. The boy opened the gate and let us in. Walking along a path covered in small pink stones, I reached the front door. The boy came forward and rang the bell. A woman of about 35 opened the door. When she saw us, she looked alarmed. "Juan, what's happened to Ernesto?" she exclaimed, stepping back to let us in. His friends pushed him off the pier. "Fortunately, I managed to save him," I replied briefly. Noticing the look the woman gave the boy, I went into the living room and laid Ernesto down on a white leather sofa. "Is that true?" I heard the woman ask, addressing the older boy, Juan, who seemed to be her son. Her voice was calm, but tinged with anger. "Yes," replied the boy in a low voice. "Go to your room. You're grounded. I'll tell your father to talk to you when he gets back." A moment later, the woman appeared in the living room. "We're very grateful to you," she said. "This is my nephew Ernesto, my brother's son. They came to visit us with my father." I nodded. Your son has already told me. Please leave your phone number. I'm sure my father will want to thank you personally." I was about to shake my head and say that I didn't need anything, but the woman looked at me with such gratitude that I couldn't refuse. I gave her my number and said goodbye quickly. Later in the evening, while sitting on the balcony of a cozy cafe, sipping a coffee, I received a call. "You have no idea how grateful I am that you saved my grandson," said Ernesto's grandfather. "I don't understand what happened to Juan and his friends' minds, but they behaved extremely badly. I'd like to thank you personally. Could we meet somewhere in the city tonight, if it's convenient for you? Of course, I don't expect any reward from you, but if you insist, that's fine." We agreed to meet in the city's Central Park in an hour. I calmly finished my coffee and headed there. Near the clock tower, a tall man of about 60 in a dark suit was already waiting for me. I was surprised. It was a weekend, and meeting someone in a suit was practically impossible. As I approached, the man shook my hand and introduced himself. "My name is Antonio Salivar." I introduced myself. We walked along one of the park's boulevards and started chatting. Antonio was a successful businessman who lived in the capital and often traveled around the country. "And you, Enrico, are a young specialist who has just graduated from university?" "That's right," I replied, surprised by his knowledge. "Mr. Antonio smiled. "Over the years, I've learned a bit about how to understand people." I nodded with a smile too. It was incredibly easy to talk to this man, as if we had known each other for many years. He had a way of putting people at ease, speaking in a calm and respectful tone. "So tell me, Enrico, what are you doing in this small town with no prospects? Visiting relatives like me?" I sighed and shook my head. "It's something else," I replied and told our sad story. "Mr. Salivar listened attentively and then thought for a while. I didn't know why, but I eagerly awaited his answer. "First of all, I'm sorry about you. However, in my experience, there are no hopeless situations." His words made my heart leap with joy. "It seems that our meeting was no accident. It turns out that a good friend of mine invests in a lot of medical research. If you tell me more about your loved one's mother's illness, I'll check with him to see if there's any recent information on the subject." I nodded encouragingly and told him everything I knew. Antonio made some notes on his phone and promised to find out everything the next day. We walked around the park a bit more, then went to a cafe and finally said goodbye. I had the most pleasant impressions that night and couldn't sleep for a long time, remembering our conversation. The next day I woke up very early and waited for Antonio to call. He called around midday and told me what he had discovered. My friend really invests a lot in the area we need. Imagine I asked him to help us. I now have the contact details of Mr. Castro, Salivar's friend. "Mary, I'm sure we can't miss this opportunity. What if we can really help Mrs. Elena? Please get back to me as soon as possible and I'll contact Mr. A. Castro immediately. P.S. I miss you terribly. Love, your Enrico." After reading this letter, I couldn't hold back the tears. Enrico still loved me and missed me, and he also found a way to help my mother. I couldn't understand it all. After gathering my thoughts, I pressed the reply button and wrote, "Dear Enrico, you have no idea how grateful I am to you. I'm going to talk to Mom right now. Of course, even if she has doubts, I'll convince her to give it a try. You're absolutely right. We can't miss this opportunity. And I want you to know that I love and miss you too. Yours, Mary." Having sent the letter, I ran to my mother's room and told her everything. Elena couldn't believe her ears. Mixed feelings of hope for recovery and, at the same time, fear of the unknown arose in her soul. "Mom," I said gently, holding her hand, "I'll be by your side no matter what happens. You have nothing to worry about." Elena, trusting me, agreed to try. I wrote to Enrico about it and immediately received a reply saying that he would do everything he could. An hour later, the phone rang and Enrico's name appeared on the display of my smartphone. My voice trembling with emotion, I answered. "Hello? Mary?" I heard the familiar voice. "Enrico, I'm so happy to hear from you," I exclaimed into the phone. "Me too," he replied quickly. "I found out everything. Mr. Castro, Antonio's friend, is ready to meet us and help us. You need to come to the capital. I'll be there too." Oh, Enrico, I'm so worried, but I'm sure my mother has a chance. I'll book tickets for the next flight right away. Great. Let me know later so I can meet them. Enrico, thank you, I said softly. Not yet, he replied, but I knew he was very pleased. I love you, I whispered. And I love you, replied Enrico. I hung up the phone and started looking for tickets for the next flight. The flight would take about an hour and a half, and I was worried about how Elena would cope. Fortunately, everything went well. With my help, the woman managed to board and fell asleep peacefully in her seat during the flight. At the airport, Enrico was already waiting for us. When I saw his familiar silhouette, my heart leapt for joy. Enrico ran up to us, hugged me and then Elena, picked up our bags and said, I've rented a car. Come on, it's in the parking lot. I took Elena by the arm and we headed for the exit. Enrico walked beside us, glancing at me frequently. He helped his mother into the back seat, got into the car, and we set off. I hadn't met Mr. Castro yet, but I thought he would be as pleasant as Antonio Salivar, with whom I quickly became friends. We drove through the streets of the capital, and I observed the city's buildings and skyscrapers. It seemed that life here flowed at a completely different pace. Rivers of people flowed back and forth, and there were bright signs for bakeries, boutiques, cafes, and various businesses everywhere. Elena fell asleep again, exhausted by the journey. Finally, Enrico parked near a tall building. This is where Mr. Castro's company is. He expects us at 2 o'clock. I just nodded in response, trusting Enrico completely and ready to follow him blindly wherever he led me. He helped Elena out of the car and we entered the building. A young, dark-haired receptionist escorted us to the elevators, informing us that Mr. Castro's office was on the 5th floor. He's expecting you, the young man added, waving to Enrico. We thanked the receptionist and called the elevator. Mr. Castro's office was very bright and spacious. The owner was busy when we entered. He was reviewing and signing papers. When he saw us, he nodded briefly and pointed to the chairs on the other side of his large desk. Enrico helped Elena to sit down, pulled out a chair for me, and then sat down. Mr. Castro made a mixed impression. His severe appearance revealed an uncommunicative person. He was very tall and thin, with a face covered in wrinkles and gray hair that stood out in all directions. I didn't like him, but I believed that this man could help my mother. I cast a quick glance at Enrico and realized that he had the same impression. He felt my gaze and met my eyes. Everything will be fine, I read in them. I sighed quietly and relaxed a little. Finally, Mr. Castro looked up. I'm ready to listen to you, he said, looking sternly at Enrico. He began to relate the details of Elena's illness. You can help us, right? Enrico asked at the end of his speech. Mr. Castro remained silent for a long time. Actually, I never do anything for free. What you're asking me to do costs an enormous amount of money. He cast a critical glance at Enrico, me and Elena, and continued dryly. Judging by the way you look, you don't have that kind of money and probably never will. A wave of anger overwhelmed me, but I managed to control myself. However, as Antonio, my good friend who once helped me a lot, gave me a good reference for you, I can't refuse your request. I felt the anxiety subside. Mr. Castro fiddled with some papers and played with his pen. However, I can't do this favor for free, he said, looking at Enrico. What do you want? He asked, surprised. Antonio told me that you were a promising young chemist, correct? Mr. Castro asked directly. Enrico nodded. I need new blood. If you're willing to sign a contract with my company, I'll do everything in my power to ensure that the esteemed lady in front of me can recover. Enrico smiled. If that's all you want, I'll gladly join your company. Mr. Castro looked sternly at Enrico. But you don't know all the details, he said. Enrico hesitated. What else do I need to know? Just one small nuance, Mr. Castro said with a strange smile. The position I intend to assign you to requires you to spend 5 years conducting research in South Africa. What? Enrico paled. Do I have to move? Those are the conditions of the agreement. Either you accept or you don't. It's your choice. Enrico bit his lip. I held his wrist tightly. I want to remind you that I can't guarantee your recovery. Now that you have all the necessary information, you need to make a decision. I won't rush you. Just take a few minutes to think." With those words, Mr. Castro returned to his papers. I felt tears welling up in my eyes. Enrico looked at me with determination. "I accept," he announced. "When can I sign the contract?" "Today. I'll give all the information to the lawyer and he'll draw up the contract. Tomorrow morning you can come here and sign it." Fine. Enrico nodded. "The only thing I ask is that I can postpone the departure for a month. I feel obliged to help Mary and Elena settle in the capital initially." Mr. Castro looked at me and nodded. "That's fine. I won't keep you any longer. You can get all the information about the treatment plan from the administrator who accompanied you." Enrico nodded and stood up. Together, we helped Elena to her feet and left Mr. Castro's office. Enrico took us to the apartment he had rented. It was a cozy 2-bedroom apartment not far from the center. I helped Elena to lie down, and she fell asleep immediately. I went into the kitchen where Enrico was waiting for me. I sat down next to him and started to cry. He hugged me to comfort me and began to whisper soft words of consolation. "You need to rest. I'll go to the supermarket and buy groceries, and you go to your room and get a good night's sleep." But I shook my head. "I've missed you so much, my darling," I whispered in his ear. "I can't sleep if you're not by my side." With those words, I kissed Enrico. His heart began to beat faster. The smell of my hair and the warmth that had been the meaning of his existence for so long, and now he would have to let me go again for 5 long years. Did he believe that I would wait for him? He inhaled my perfume and couldn't get enough. I got up and took Enrico into the bedroom. Neither of us wanted those moments to end. The next day, Enrico took my mother and me to the treatment center, and then went to the office to sign the contract. The lawyer was already waiting for him, and it only took him 20 minutes to get all the formalities right. The accountant began. There were 30 days until my departure for South Africa, he thought darkly. He intended to spend as much of that time with me as possible. Since Elena was under the care of the doctors, I finally had some free time for myself. I realized that this was my last chance to be with Enrico. He would pick me up outside the clinic and we would go to the city center. We walked for a long time, holding hands, hardly speaking. It was enough to be together. I felt my beloved with every fiber of my being, and my heart broke at the thought of the imminent separation. Sensing my anguish, Enrico stopped and pulled me close. "Let's make a deal, Mary. Let's not think about the future or the past. This whole month, we're going to live in the here and now. We have nothing but the present moment, so let it be beautiful." I nodded, wiped away my tears, and kissed Enrico. We went to a cozy cafe, ordered some delicious food, and looked at each other for a long time. Afterwards, we walked back through the city and visited Elena. She was fine. She said she liked the staff and the food she'd had for lunch. When I felt that my mother was tired, I kissed her and wished her good night. Enrico took me back to the apartment, and we retired to our room again, unable to leave each other. Every day, Enrico took me to a new place after we visited Elena. It was noticeable that my mother was getting better. She still felt weak and in pain, but she looked to the future with optimism. She found the motivation to fight for her life. I was happy to see her and mentally thanked Enrico for what he had done for us. With my beloved, everything was colorful and sunny, and I tried not to think about the imminent separation. However, the days passed quickly, like sugar in a hot cup of coffee. I didn't even notice when the month came to an end. Enrico was about to leave for South Africa in 2 days, and his ticket was already booked. He wouldn't let me out of his sight for a second. We barely spoke. Enrico and I already knew how each other felt. The night before he left, we stayed up all night, unable to stop touching each other. "I want to look at you and never forget a single trace of your face," he whispered in my ear. I took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears. "In the morning, I'll take you to the airport," I replied, but Enrico shook his head. "You don't have to. I don't want you to cry alone among strangers when I'm gone." I sighed and kissed him. Enrico stroked my hair for a long time. When the alarm went off in the morning, I didn't hear it. Enrico got up quietly, got dressed, picked up his suitcase, and left the house. As he rode down in the elevator, he couldn't hold back his bitter tears. I woke up late, as usual, and turned to kiss Enrico, but he was no longer there. I cried, burying my face in the pillow. When I calmed down, I picked up my phone and checked the messages. "I love you," Enrico had written. "Have a good trip." "I love you too," I replied, and my heart ached. I lay down and the tears started flowing again. Elena was getting better and better. The treatment had lasted about 3 months and the latest drugs were having an effect. The headaches had stopped, and she didn't look as pale as usual. A pleasant flush appeared on her cheeks. Elena liked to walk through the small wood located on the clinic premises. Sometimes I accompanied her, sometimes someone from the staff. My mother's appetite improved, and she interacted happily with other patients. Life appeared before her in new colors. The disease was receding, and now she no longer had to rush anywhere, work hard, or look after others. For the first time, Elena realized that she could take a deep breath and simply enjoy the wonderful moments. I was very happy for my mother. We saw each other every day and talked at length about various subjects. For the first time in many years, I felt connected and close to my mother. I realized that I could tell her everything I was worried about, and she would respond with understanding, affection, and kindness. I found comfort in talking to my mother, although I still cried at night, missing Enrico. He called and wrote every day, but I knew it wouldn't last forever. Life separated us again, forcing us to go our separate ways, but I desperately wanted to be with my beloved and prayed every night that God would give us another chance. Finally, Elena was discharged from the clinic and we were able to return home. At first, she had to stay in bed, but she was able to walk in the park and do pleasant, quiet activities. She became interested in knitting and macrame, and her face glowed with happiness as she took up her favorite hobby. I loved seeing her happy. I decided not to go back to university, but to work remotely. I found jobs translating articles and essays and spent a lot of time on the computer, sometimes working in cozy cafes to vary my days. Life was slowly starting to return to normal. One day, in one of the cafes, a nice man sat down next to me, and we talked for a long time. He asked for my phone number, and I agreed to give it to him. The next day, Javier, as he called himself, invited me to the theater. I didn't want to go, but Elena convinced me. "Go on, darling. Get out for a while. You spend a lot of time at home, and life isn't eternal. I know that very well now." I nodded and started getting ready for the theater. I put on a beautiful green soft velvet dress, high heels, applied lipstick, and grabbed a small handbag. "You look wonderful," Elena complimented me. I smiled, but my heart was heavy. It felt like I was cheating on Enrico. Javier was waiting for me at the entrance to the theater. We had a lovely evening and he drove me home. Before saying goodbye, he tried to kiss me, but I instinctively pulled away. "Is something wrong?" Javier asked in surprise. "No, you're a wonderful person," I replied, looking at him with sad eyes. "But the point is that another man has occupied my heart for a long time." "So why aren't you together?" Javier asked. Tears began to well up in my eyes. He asked why I didn't go with him, if I loved him, and I told him my story. Javier sighed and nodded, understanding. "You can't abandon your mother, of course, but you mustn't sacrifice your own life either. I once lost the love of my life and regretted it deeply. If I could go back in time, I would have fought to the end, but back then I was foolish. I listened carefully. Don't give up, Mary. Believe that you are destined to be together, and God will grant you his mercy." I nodded and hugged Javier, feeling immense gratitude. I got out of the car and walked home. Javier watched me with a long, thoughtful look. We never saw each other again. The following week, one of my sisters called. "Hi, Mary. I'm calling to tell you some news. I'm coming home." I was surprised and didn't know what to say. "What do you mean? You've been expelled?" "I realized I chose the wrong course," my sister explained with a sigh. "Programming and I are incompatible. But Anna can't stay away from her computer. I think she's already written several volumes of code." I stopped, contemplating the information. "What are you going to do now?" I asked. "I'm not sure yet. I have a blog and it looks like it will soon bring in a decent income. I expect it to grow day by day, so I'm not going to rush it. I'm going to take some time off and spend some time with Mom. I miss her so much." "Yes, Mom misses you too. I'm glad you made a conscious decision. I hope you don't regret it." "No, I've already made my decision, I said firmly. Listen, Mary. Mom told me on the phone that Enrico has gone to South Africa. Why don't you go with him? I'm going to look after Mom now. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Was it really possible? It all seemed so simple and at the same time, unreal. I had thought for so long that my relationship with Enrico was doomed that it was hard to believe I had another chance. I remembered Javier's words and smiled. That's wonderful, I said to my sister. Thank you, dear. I've bought a ticket for Sunday, so from Monday you're officially free, sis. I smiled happily. I'll check the flights, I said, feeling wings grow on my back. I found a suitable flight and, very nervous, called Enrico. He couldn't believe it when he heard my happy, excited voice sharing the news. This is incredible, he whispered. I'm going to cancel everything and meet you at the airport. I smiled. Next week, we'd be together again. The days flew by like an hour. When the plane landed at the airport and I entered the large hall with my suitcase, I immediately saw Enrico with a huge bouquet of hydrangeas. He approached me, kissed me passionately on the lips, and I